Hello, everyone. Can you hear me there in the back? It's a pleasure to be here, and this is my first visit to Canada. I've been to Vancouver and now here in Kelowna. So what we are going to talk today about is immunity, of course, natural immunity, vaccine-based immunity. Are vaccines making us immune or not? And if not, why? So the outline for today's talk, we will talk about facts, theory, and choices of disease control. And we are really, the meat of it is really the choices, right? We want to know what to do, what's the best for our kids, for our grandchildren, for children in general. But we need to look into facts and theory too. And I had a professor at Stanford, my favorite professor of statistics. And she was quite direct, and she said something, quoting someone else, I guess. She said that facts without theory is nonsense, and theory without facts is bullshit. Sorry. So you need to have both. So you need to have a theory which is supported by facts, but also you cannot just have facts alone because you won't be able to make sense of them. You need a theory that gives you some framework of understanding with which you understand the facts, and in this way you can predict or expect what would be the outcomes of your actions, right? And once we cover the facts and theory, we will go into choices. And what is the theory that we will be talking about mainly? It's, of course, the theory of herd immunity, because that's the concept that's used a lot for political reasons and sometimes for psychological reasons sometimes to put parents who choose not to vaccinate, to make them feel guilty that what you're choosing for your kid will affect the neighbor's child or someone else. And we would like to look into that and see whether this is true or not. Okay, so what I would like to do is, instead of talking about diseases in general, to focus really on one specific disease, one specific vaccine, and that would be measles, because there is a lot of controversy about that. Every disease and every vaccine is a little bit different. We have toxin-mediated diseases, we have invasive bacterial diseases. Measles is a viral disease, right? So what applies to one set of diseases would be, we will have completely different considerations for a different disease. So let's do measles. And of course, during the discussion time, we can cover other things as well briefly. So let's look into measles facts. I hear a lot that people say, well, before vaccination, diseases were eradicated already, and vaccination came and claimed the credit. But for measles, this is not the case, so we have to be careful. So this is, these figures are taken from the paper by Langmuir, American epidemiologist, and he published that in 1962. This is 1 year before measles vaccine was introduced in the United States in '63. So what he shows here is that the cases of measles, the measles incidence is pretty much stable. It fluctuates up and down. This is expected of epidemics. They come and go. But it's pretty much stable. There is no trend down. But in terms of deaths from measles, there is an obvious trend, right? And this is the years of 1912, 1959. So measles was there, but over the first half of the 20th century, it was getting less and less deadly, right? So something was changing. Now, in the 60s, the vaccine was introduced, but let's see who was mostly affected by death from measles, right? So here on figure 3, we have sort of 3 graphs here. Morbidity is just a term for illness. Mortality is death. So, and this is the age distribution. So we have from age 0 to 15 everywhere. So we see that the majority of measles illness was happening in children, right? And by the time they reach 15, pretty much everyone had their measles. And because of the immunity, no one really had measles second time. So there was no measles in the adulthood. That's why diseases like measles are called childhood diseases, right? But then the majority of deaths were happening really in very, very young kids, infants pretty much, around the age 1. And so if you calculate case fatality ratio, it's very much age dependent. And so you see that children, maybe 3 years old or 2.5 and beyond, the measles mortality was only 1 in 10,000, according to this estimate. 1 in 10,000, I would say it's pretty rare, because just for comparison, at that time in the 40s, in the 50s, the rate of autism was 1 in 10,000, and no one heard about autism. So this is just for comparison purposes. But of course, in the younger age group, the mortality was much higher. And this is problematic, of course. We don't want to leave it that way. So, you know, measles virus was put on the list of eradication because, you know, it causes us problems, so we have to get rid of it, right? There was another way to deal with childhood mortality, and I will talk about it more at the end. But just to mention what it is, breastfeeding, and we will talk about why. But for now, let's concentrate on the eradication campaign and see what came out of it. So in 1963, measles vaccine is introduced in the United States, and I think in Canada as well. And here you see that in the next 5 years, the incidence of measles goes down dramatically. And with such a precipitous decline, one would think, well, it should be eliminated right there. But no, something is happening. After 5 years, the measles kind of stabilized, right? And although the levels are now tenfold less, here it was maybe 500,000 cases per year, and here is only 50,000 at the most, you know, at the peak of the epidemic. But these peaks just continue, right, with some periodicity. So then another vaccine is introduced, double dose, right? In 1989. In Canada, the double dose was introduced a little bit later in 1996. And then by the year 2000, measles was declared eradicated in the United States, and in Canada, the number is 2002. But we still have measles, right? We still hear that there are outbreaks of measles here and there. And the officials tell us that all of these outbreaks are imported outbreaks, that there is no more endemic measles, meaning native to the land. What was here, all the virus that was native to this land is eradicated. So therefore, we have to keep vaccinating because measles is still in some other countries and people travel and bring measles back. Therefore, we have to keep vaccinating. So we would think, okay, so if everyone or most of the children are vaccinated here, then what are these outbreaks, right? Are they occurring only in those who were left unvaccinated for some reason? Or what is going on? But actually, no. If you look at the papers, the medical literature, you will see that measles outbreaks involve not only unvaccinated, but also vaccinated children. And so I will just read the titles. Measles outbreak in a vaccinated school population. Major measles epidemic in the region of Quebec despite a 99% vaccine coverage. Outbreak of measles in a highly vaccinated secondary school population. And the last one, pretty recent, the largest measles epidemic in North America in a decade. So all of this is published in the journals of public health or epidemiology. And the interesting thing is that my field, the field of immunology, the basic field, the ones that sort of is responsible for all these theories of immunity, we don't really deal with the real world. We do research in labs. We are sort of an ivory tower profession. And we don't even read these publications because this is too far away from our field. We only read what's specific to our research, and usually it's immunizations and how antibodies are generated and all the details of the immune responses. And I went through my whole PhD training, and I believe that vaccines give you immunity, and that if you got vaccines, there is absolutely no way, virtually no way, that you would get a disease. And I'm pretty sure that most of my colleagues in my narrow field believe the same way, and we had conversations about that. And even someone at some point mentioned to me and said that they had a vaccine and they got measles, and I sort of brushed it aside, and the person is confused. It was either she didn't have the vaccine or it wasn't measles, one of the two. But what happened is that a few years ago, I had to apply for American citizenship, and part of the procedure is to submit your vaccination records, right? And this was the first time that I looked at my own vaccination records carefully, and I discovered that I had 2 measles vaccines in my childhood. Well, I didn't know about it because I was too young to remember. But what I remember really well is that when I was 11, I had measles. And so that was a little bit harder to discount. And I told recently someone else, and they said, "Oh, you are confused about that. You didn't have measles. Like, how do you know? Like, did you check your, was really the virus there or not?" So it just, the doctor's diagnosis, right? But I lived in Ukraine, and there, there was tons of measles around, and doctors knew when they saw measles. But anyway, so the reason I kind of had to look for these papers is to actually to confirm to myself whether I'm confused about my measles, or is this a general phenomenon and it's happening, and it's documented in the literature, and indeed it is documented in the literature. But immunologists don't know about it. Okay, so let's look a little bit more specifically into the last paper, the SARS 2011, because this is close to our times and to home. So this is the outbreak that happened in Quebec in 2011 in the spring. And here's a few curious details that I took from this paper. So this outbreak, it's post-elimination era, so it's an imported outbreak. It was imported by a high school teacher, an adult. He was himself vaccinated against measles in his childhood. So he went on a spring break abroad, and then when he returned, he got sick, he felt sick, but for the first 3 days of his sickness, he was still teaching. And because of that, I guess not realizing that, how could that be measles or anything? Measles in the beginning looks like flu, really. I had it, so I know. So probably he didn't realize. So he was teaching, and he infected a lot of high school students, right? And the students then infected the whole community around. So from this one teacher, the mode of transmission, and about more than 600 people in the community got measles. The thing about that community is that it had really high vaccination coverage. So 95% of high school and 97% of the community were vaccine compliant for measles. And there were no pockets, concentrated pockets of unvaccinated groups. We have that sometimes in the United States, where there are Amish groups or some religious groups that they live together, they don't want to vaccinate, but that region didn't have that. So another interesting fact is that if you look at the measles cases, 48% of them had 2 vaccines. And the other 52% were either not vaccinated or had 1 vaccine. But now, because of the policy that you have to have 2 vaccines to be considered properly vaccinated, all who have 1 vaccine are kind of put together with those who are unvaccinated. So, but after this thing, it will be considered that even those who have 2 vaccines are not vaccinated unless you have 3 vaccines. You will see what will come out of this. But this is how we get more and more boosters slowly. Another interesting thing is that those vaccinated or twice vaccinated vaccine failures, how should we call them, they were not really randomly distributed. There was a trend that with age, you were more likely to get a disease. So if you have your vaccine in the childhood, and then the older you are, the more likely that you would contribute to the measles outbreak, right? So in the younger age group, the contribution was only 4% of the twice vaccinated, and then in the older age groups, it was 18 to 22%. And finally, the outbreak affected 21 infants, right? So this is something to remember, that an outbreak in a almost fully vaccinated community still reaches infants. And infants cannot be vaccinated. They're called vaccine ineligible because for MMR you can only start at age 1, not earlier than that. And one of the things, measles vaccine is considered to be a very effective vaccine, and you find references or discussions in the medical literature that it's 95% effective. So we would agree that that's pretty good number, right? We think 95 is pretty good. So is it possible that if you have such an effective vaccine, and if the population is so highly vaccinated, can you have an outbreak in which 50% of the cases will be vaccinated? And the answer is actually yes. It's totally reasonable. So let's look at some more simplified calculation. So usually they use a very complicated formula to kind of calculate it, but I will just illustrate it just by averaging things. There is a community of 100 people who got affected by the outbreak, right? So let's say 95%, I lost, okay, here. 95 people were vaccinated and 5 were not for various reasons. Then if the vaccine is 95% effective, then 90% will be protected by that vaccine, right? Because 95% of 95% is 90. And 5 people will not be protected even though they were vaccinated. Now, when we look at the outbreak, only these will be affected, right? So you will have 5 people unvaccinated and 5 people vaccinated. So you have your 50-50. So in a way, it makes sense on one hand. But we are forgetting about something that, you know, the establishment reminds us every day, the herd immunity. Where is the protective effect of herd immunity in this picture? Because this is what we really observed in the Quebec outbreak. We have an outbreak which had 50-50 vaccinated and not, and the whole province was 95% vaccinated, and it all adds up, except that there is this concept of herd immunity. So how did it start? And if there was a herd immunity here, they wouldn't have an outbreak at all, right? Because those 90% would kind of form a shield and would not allow that virus to reach so many unvaccinated or those who are vaccine failures or the infants, right? But that didn't happen. So let's talk a little bit about herd immunity and where it comes from. So the concept of herd immunity was established in the 30s, before there were any vaccines, or at least not the live attenuated viral vaccines. And there was Dr. Hedrick, I think, so he observed this fluctuation in how epidemics come to the community, and then they go, and then they come and go. And so he wanted to understand what determines why a certain community would have an epidemic one year but not another year. And in the past, the only way that you can have immunity is if you have the disease, right? You go through the disease, you establish your immunity, and then you're not getting the disease again. And so he established that in those years where the proportion of immune children was more than 68%, there would not be epidemic in the community. But if it falls below 68%, so it's 1/3, 2/3, right? 2/3. Then you would have an outbreak, which of course will make everyone immune again, and then you need a few more years to wait until new babies are born, and they kind of dilute that, right? So this is how it goes. And so the number is 68%. And here we have, but that's with naturally acquired immunity. Here we have with vaccine immunity, 90% of protection by vaccine, right? And we still do not observe the protective effect of the herd immunity. So I just want to summarize what I said so far. Measles incidence is sharply reduced after the vaccine is introduced, but then it kind of lingers for almost 40 years. It doesn't go away completely. And eventually, after 40 years, it is eradicated. But then, of course, we have sporadic outbreaks which are imported. Then, during all these outbreaks that still occur, although at lower levels, they involve unvaccinated and vaccinated individuals. And the third part is that vaccine-based herd immunity, the effect of it is not evident in a specific outbreak. And if you look at others, you saw there was a paper about 99% vaccination coverage and still having an outbreak. So something kind of doesn't add up, and we really need to understand what it is. Well, we could, of course, brush it under the carpet and just go with our lives. But since we are making vaccination decisions or we have to defend our choices, it's better if we understand. So the second part, we will look into how we can explain this discrepancy between naturally acquired immunity versus vaccine herd immunity, and where is it gone. But I can take a few questions, maybe clarification questions for now, if anyone has any.
So the herd immunity should be 68% according to that doctor in 1930?
As long as it is naturally acquired immunity.
And the Quebec one was, you said 50%?
Quebec was 95 vaccination coverage, 90% protected by vaccine.
Okay.
So it's a big difference. Okay.
So how did they get from naturally occurring immunity to now they're just translating that into herd immunity being through
Vaccine.
vaccine?
Just
Assumption.
by assumption, yeah, because the idea is that vaccine immunity is the same, is equivalent to naturally acquired immunity. And there was a question there.
What's the name of the doctor?
Hedrick, Hedrich. And I think VRAN has information about that. VRAN, the Canadian network, Vaccine Awareness Network. I think they have good information there.
Excuse me, is there any chance there's anything you could stand on? Because if we could see your mouth, we could hear you better.
Here, you better. Mike.
What?
This is pretty tall.
Stand up on that. That looks very real.
Yeah. Okay, so let's look for explanations. And the next part will be a little bit intense on immunologic type of data, something that I might be doing in the lab. So, but it's really 1 or 2 slides. So if we can go through that, I think it's really crucial to see that data. But let's start first with definitions. So we talked a little bit about immunity. What is immunity? There are actually 2 parts. And sometimes we say natural immunity, but what we mean is really natural defenses, natural immune defenses. Immunity is a second thing. So first, when we encounter the virus for the first time, we never were in contact with that virus before, the virus establishes infection in us, right? And in order to overcome that infection, we need our natural defenses. And sometimes people refer to that as natural immunity or innate immunity. But once you are past that stage, once you overcome, you survive this first infection, the first disease, you get your immunity. And when it happens naturally, we call it naturally acquired immunity. So the difference is innate versus acquired, right? So in immunology, when we say immunity, we really refer to this acquired immunity, not your natural defenses that protect you, that help you overcome the infection the first time. That's not immunity. That's just the state of the immune system or defenses or innate immune system. And immunity you get pretty much automatically once you survive the disease. But of course, the important thing is to survive the disease. If you die, then you don't get immunity, right? So that's why it's very important to understand what natural defenses are and how to build them, how to make sure that they're strong. However, immunologists or immunology field thinks that we can bypass the first part and go directly to the second part by means of vaccination. So we think that you get your vaccine and you have immunity, right? The second part. We will see that's true. And there is also a lot of confusion between immunity and immunization, right? And people use it interchangeably. But those are two different things. Well, immunity is a state. Immunization is really a procedure, right? Immunization is a procedure that involves injection of some foreign substance, foreign viruses, right, or foreign proteins into your body. And the intention of that procedure is to activate your immune system, generate antibodies, generate sort of long-term changes in T cells, B cells, all of these terms, all of these cells that we study in the immunology. And vaccination is pretty much the same as immunization, except that it's done for a certain purpose. There are certain viruses that we use for vaccination. And of course, the purpose, the intention, hopefully that will prevent the corresponding disease. But immunization is a more general term, and we do immunizations in mice with any random protein that we can think of just to study how immune system responds to that. But these are two different, these are two very similar things, but immunity is something different. Immunity is a state, not a procedure. So does immunization lead to immunity or not? In immunology, we don't really test immunity directly, because to test that, you would have to do certain procedures to mice, to animals, and then challenge them with a pathogen and see if they are protected, if they get the infection or not. But this is rarely done, and instead, immunologists like to rely on antibody titers, right? To see if you have titers that are high, that supposedly you are protected, and that if the titers are low or no titers, then you are not. So that's a sort of a substitute that we use. But even with that, you will see a very clear difference in the experiments that I'll show you. So here, this was done in an immunology lab. Immunization of mice with a virus, which is called vesicular stomatitis virus, or VSV for short. This virus it's a relative of rabies virus, but it's not dangerous as rabies. So if you inject mice with this, it is spread through bites, right? Mice will not die from it, okay? Or humans if you, by mistake, stick yourself with the needle. So that's why they use this kind of virus in the lab to study immune responses. So here in this particular experiment, they compared the effect of the same virus, which was either live or inactivated. And they inactivated the virus by treating it with UV light. And what UV light does, it prevents the virus from being able to replicate. So it's sort of a dead virus. And then so they injected those two different viruses into mice. And then at different time points after this immunization, they took blood from mice and tested if the blood has, or serum, which they made from blood, if the serum has protective capacity. And this protective capacity is attributed to the presence of antibodies against the virus. So sometimes this test is also called neutralization test. They take the serum, incubate it with fresh virus, and then try to infect a layer of cells in the Petri dish with that virus and see if the virus is infective or not. And if the virus is not infective anymore, doesn't kill the cells in the Petri dish, then it is considered that serum has neutralization properties. And sort of this is what immunologists like to correlate with immunity. So here's the difference. So when they did this experiment with live virus, the protective serum titers stayed high for a long time. So this is 300 days. In a mouse life, this is probably half of the mouse life. The mouse lives only 2 years or so. But when they did the same thing with inactivated virus, you see a difference, that the protective titers crashed. And at the end, there was nothing, pretty much. Okay, from the point of view of the immune system and how we like to think about it presently, is that the immune system reacts to just matter. And these viruses, they're exactly the same molecular viruses. They have exactly the same structure. They should look the same to the immune system, the way we think immune system works. And yet there is this big difference in how it affects the antibody production of this serum, protective serum capacity. So the live virus induces serum capacity, which is long-lasting and doesn't even have any trend for decrease that much. An inactivated virus just crashes. Okay, so that's mice. Let's move to humans and to measles, since we talk about measles. So here we have a study in 2007, persistence of measles antibodies after 2 doses of measles vaccine in a post-elimination environment. So what they wanted to know if they had 600 kids in the study who were due for their second MMR vaccine at the age of 5, kindergarten. And they wanted to see how long the titers, the protective serum titers, will last after that, after the second dose. It would be nice to know, of course, what happened after the first dose, but we don't have that information because this is how the study is designed, and you just work with what you have, right? So we don't really know what happened before. But here they have titers that they took right before vaccination, before second shot, right? And then they vaccinated, and then they followed these kids for 10 years to see what is happening with their titers. I just want to clarify, so because they had 600 kids, they could not possibly plot every individual point, right? So what they did, they divided the whole pool into 4 groups. They call it quartiles. So just the first 25%, the next 25%, the next 25%, and then they averaged the numbers, right? So these 4 lines is the average of the highest group, of the group with the highest titers, and then next highest and medium and lowest. So these are just 4 different averages. And what we see here, just like on the previous slide with mice, with inactivated VSV, the titers go down. Now, measles vaccine is an attenuated viral vaccine. So it's a virus that was first isolated from some sick kid and then attenuated in a lab to make it less able to replicate. But it's still replicating, so it's attenuated, not a killed virus. And so it has probably an intermediate effect between a live virus and a killed virus. So it's somewhere in between. So we see that the titers don't stay high. The antibodies don't stay high. And when people have measles vaccine, I presume that the understanding was that the titers stay high. And this is how you determine, even later on in life, that you have immunity to measles if it was natural measles, right? So even later in life, you can check your blood and see you have antibodies to measles. That means you had it in the childhood. But with vaccine, the titers go down. So interesting thing is that you see how there is a distribution. Like there are some kids who we would call them high responders. They were already high to start with after the first booster, right? So this is sort of the baseline after the first booster. And there are some who are really low, and we would call them low responders. Another thing is that after the booster, or we shouldn't even call it booster, second vaccine, the titers just spike a little bit and then go down pretty much 6 months later back to the background level. So it's like the effect of the second dose, I don't know, it goes back to where it was really fast. Okay, and then this experiment was done in post-elimination era, so none of these kids can have measles to even see who will be protected from measles or who not, right? So we don't know if this level might be protective. How about this level, or this level, or this level? This is just a theoretical assumption. However, there was a study in the past, which was done in 1990, which was quite interesting, serendipitously interesting. So this was in Boston University, where they had a blood drive on campus. So they collected blood from lots of students, and then a month later, the campus was hit with measles outbreak. And so because they collected the blood right before the outbreak, they could correlate what level they could measure now, the antibodies in those samples, and then see who was affected by outbreak and who wasn't. And by the way, most of the kids in that study, they were vaccinated. They were vaccinated in the childhood, and now they are college students. And so what they found that there were two thresholds of antibody levels. So those who had, let's say, a number of 120, so somewhere here at the bottom, those showed no protection from clinical measles. They had full-blown, clinically identifiable measles with rash and everything. Those who were between 120 and 1,000, they still had infection, but the infection did not result in clinical measles. So it was just like some flu symptoms, some respiratory symptoms. So they were not defined as measles cases for the purposes of statistics, but they were infected with the measles virus. And so they're 70% in that range, so it would be somewhere over here, right? So among these kids, 70% would have the infection, which they possibly can spread to others, but not the clinical measles themselves. And then above 1,000, there were fewer such people. And though, of course, those who are very high probably didn't get any symptoms whatsoever. So if you go back to herd immunity, and you think when we had naturally acquired immunity, those 68%, they were not getting measles second time themselves, and probably they were not even getting infection second time themselves, right? So they were really impervious barrier. Now, even though if we have children like this and 100% of them are vaccinated, at some point after 5 years or 10 years, there will be a certain percentage who will fall below 120. And if the outbreak comes, they will have a full-blown measles. And that would be the 5% that contributes to measles cases. Now, the rest of the population doesn't really contribute to measles statistics, yet they can potentially transmit the measles to infants and whatnot. And as you see, it looks like the high responders are really a minority. It's like only 25%. And the rest kind of cluster on the bottom. So even with 100% vaccination coverage, it seems like 10 years later, you will have only 25% who are really forming the herd immunity, and that's much lower than 68%. So that's why with vaccination, they keep raising this threshold. They were telling us, okay, maybe it's 70% that we need, then 80, then 90, now we need 100% to ensure herd immunity with vaccination, right? And even with 100%, a few years down the road, those who are low responders will no longer be a part of herd immunity, right? Will no longer contribute to herd immunity. And it's not their fault, and we will see why. The thing is about this, there was a study also that those who were low responders, and they responded very little after the first boost, after the first vaccine, the second vaccine is not going to boost their titers much more. It would be just like here, just a little bit up and back to the background. And why is that? We actually have an explanation. An explanation comes from no one else but Dr. Gregory Poland, and some of you might know him. He wrote a clinician guide to the anti-vaccinationist galaxy. So it's a very curious piece that really says how the anti-vaccine movement endangers us all and whatever Paul Offit is saying. So they're sort of on the same page. And yet here there is a very interesting article by him him and the establishment, I guess, are aware that children respond differently to measles vaccine, and some are high responders, some are low responders. And so they hypothesized and confirmed their hypothesis that this correlates with genetic variability in our human population. So there are certain genes in the immune system. I can give you the names, HLA or TAP. These genes are responsible for antigen presentation and processing. And therefore, everyone is a little bit different in how they process the antigens that we are immunized with. And so some individuals, there are certain polymorphisms in these genes. And so these polymorphisms allow them to present the antigens better. And so they become high responders. And others have different polymorphisms. And they are low responders. That's what they are. And I guess I'm a low responder because I got measles after only 5 years after my last vaccine. And no one really checks their titers on a regular basis, except maybe for doctors who have to prove their levels of immunity, right, in order to maintain their hospital affiliation. Sometimes, I think in the United States at least. But no one really knows where we are on this scheme, right, and where we started. We also do not know in advance for our children or grandchildren, are they going to be low responders or high responders? And if they're low responders, they're not going to really get much benefit out of that vaccine because a few years later they are back to being susceptible again to measles. And it's only these high responders, sorry, what happened here? Okay, that we would consider benefiting if the benefit is to prevent measles, right? But really, the whole reason why we started eradicating measles is because it wasn't really deadly in older children, right? It was deadly in infants. And infants cannot be vaccinated. So therefore, we thought that we would be relying on herd immunity. And yet we cannot rely on herd immunity. And when the real outbreak happens, infants still get involved in it. And there is no way around it now. There was a way, but we will discuss that. Okay, so, okay, now it doesn't move. Okay, here. So the first article, the one that I said, was talking about genetic variability and how it affects immune response against the vaccine and makes the vaccine effective in some children but not in others. That is sort of immunogenetics. That's the field of immunogenetics. Dr. Poland also coined a new term, adversomics, and he wrote an article on that too. What is adversomics? Well, if there is a genetic variation in how humans respond to vaccines, there might be also genetic variation to how vaccines generate adverse reactions, right? Because we vaccinate almost everyone, and some kids come down with adverse vaccine reactions and some don't. So it is reasonable to assume that there is a genetic susceptibility to that. There could be other factors too, metabolic susceptibilities and others, but genetic is something that needs to be addressed. And sort of the establishment is starting to pay lip service to that yes, we need to address that. But I just been to the Vancouver Vaccine Summit, and some parents were presenting their stories. And one of the parents said, well, my child, he got MMR, and within some short period of time, he developed this disease called immune thrombocytopenic purpura. It's a condition where immune system destroys platelets, and because of that, the blood cannot clot well, and the whole body starts to be covered with bruises, so the person becomes purple pretty much. And I guess it's life-threatening. So they had to rush to emergency and everything. The kid was okay afterwards, but it's very scary. The mom, of course, suspected MMR and to cause that, but that was 13 years ago. but the doctors and everyone whom she tried to approach to discuss that, they stonewalled her. They would not admit that MMR has anything to do with that. Now, in this article, 2009, Dr. Poland all of a sudden tells us that 75% of ITP of this condition is caused by MMR. Okay, so this is like 10 years later, whatever parents' observations and hunches and what she shared with other parents and found similar stories on internet or other ways, all of that is not acknowledged, and 10 years later, all of a sudden, it's true. So imagine right now, parents complain about all kinds of things that they observe after what's happening to their kids, and all of that is considered irrational, unscientific, and just wait a few decades and we will see. The thing is that Dr. Poland acknowledges that there could be a genetic susceptibilities, right? From this, acknowledgement to actually having all comprehensive set of data that we can catalog which gene and which vaccine would result in combination would result to adverse effect, and to be able to predict in advance which kid is likely to have the adverse effect and which kid is okay, we are really far from that. So right now, whatever decisions that we are making in terms of when we try to estimate the risk of vaccines, we cannot really make personalized risk-benefit analysis, right? Because we just don't know that information. We know it's happening, but we don't know what we have to correlate with what. So this is the situation that we are in. And we will discuss our choices after that. But before, let's go back to the original question. And so we know that disease like measles got eradicated, right? It's pretty clear that it went away. And it's also, with other diseases, there could be, some arguments that it coincided with vaccination, but maybe there were other factors like sanitation or whatever. With measles, measles cannot be dealt with sanitation because it's an airborne disease. Also, quarantine, I'm not familiar what was happening in the United States, but I would assume that no one would be applying quarantine on such a huge level, right? So probably it was not quarantine that eradicated the disease. So it's probably the vaccine that eradicated the disease, and yet it's not via herd immunity, it's not via immunity, it's something else. And I haven't really found any good explanation because, herd immunity kind of eclipses everything else, right? So I personally, I don't know what eradicates the disease, except that it's clearly going away with vaccination. I have my own theory, which is completely speculative. I can share with you, but you don't have to believe it or anything. So the way that helps me think about this is that we like to look at the situation from our perspective, but let's look at it from the perspective of the virus. So virus, like any other animal, needs to reproduce, and the breeding grounds for the virus are us, right? Because that's where the virus infects us, multiplies, then spreads to others. And we are the habitat of the virus. The way it was kind of equilibrated itself is that the virus could only reproduce in children between 1 and 15, right? Because the rest of the population was immune and off limits to the virus. So that was sort of the habitat of the virus, these children. And then here comes the vaccine. And in the first 5 years, it makes a huge bulk of children not susceptible to the virus, because in the beginning, you have some vaccine effect, right? It later goes away after 5 years or 10 years. So all of a sudden, the virus loses its habitat, like abruptly. And so the same happens to other species. If we remove their habitat, we don't allow them to reproduce, they go extinct, right? Or they diminish in their numbers. And maybe this is what's happening to the virus as well, that it's just becoming extinct because it doesn't have the habitat. But then after some time, some of the vaccinated kids become susceptible again, right? And there is some virus around, so it kind of equilibrated at a lower level, and finally it goes away. So this is sort of my theory, and this is how I like to think about it, because still we need to find an explanation of what is eradicating the virus, right? And how do we reduce the exposure to the virus? Okay, but then we have also to think whether the reduction of exposure to the virus is a good thing. And I would say that it's not necessarily a good thing, because although we're eliminating the virus, we are also at the same time eliminating something else which is very precious, and that's maternal immunity. And we are eliminating maternal immunity much faster than we are eliminating the virus. So let's take a look at that. And so the majority of kids had their measles or their mumps or rubella by the time they're 15, right? So by the time they are childbearing age, they already have immunity in the past. So here there is data that actually estimates the proportion of measles immune by age, right? And it correlates pretty much as the majority of kids have their measles, the levels of proportion of immunes in the population grows and almost reaches 100, maybe not 100, but close. And mothers, sort of the mothers of all mammalian species, including humans, they have the ability to transfer their immunity to infants. And they do it through two methods, or two sort of ways. One is through placenta during pregnancy. Some of the serum goes through, and that sort of protects the infant, if of course the mother is immune and has those antibodies. And after birth, this protection lasts for about 6 months. It just, those antibodies that still linger in the baby, but then they sort of go away, right? Because the mom and the baby are separated now. But then through breastfeeding, this kind of protection can continue, because then when someone gets measles or any infection, the mucous cell immunity forms these cells, which during pregnancy migrate to the mammary gland and secrete antibodies into the breast milk, right, once it started to be produced. So then you can extend this protection for as long as you breastfeed. And so in the 60s, in the United States, moms were not really breastfeeding. There was like 10 or even less % of women who were breastfeeding. Right now it's a little bit, the trend is reversed and it's growing, the awareness of it. So all those babies, starting from 6 months, so there was no measles before 6 months, so very rare, because there was still maternal immunity that was transferred through placenta and that lasted until 6 months. But from 6 months to, let's say, 2 years old, right, there's still this somewhat vulnerable period for infants. Breastfeeding could have taken care of it if women were encouraged to breastfeed. So then we would reduce, measles mortality in the young kids. So let's see what's happening here instead. This paper describes an outbreak in the United States that happened in the 90s. So that is the last outbreak that was there. And it looks at the infants who were exposed to the measles virus. There was a known exposure, so these infants were in contact with someone who within a few days developed measles. And some of the infants developed measles and some didn't, right? So the researchers wanted to see what makes the difference. And what made the difference was the year of birth of the mom. And so moms who were born before 63, when the measles vaccine was introduced, were less likely to have their measles, to have their infants have measles compared to younger moms. And this trend was kind of proportional to when they were born. So ideally, the study would be designed to see which mom had measles disease but not the vaccine, or who had vaccine but not the disease, or who had both. And that would give a very clear indication. However, they didn't have that data. So they didn't have vaccination records of the moms so clearly. So they could sort of break it by the age or by the year of birth and sort of assume that those who were born before 63 were more likely to get the disease, right, because the measles was still there, than those who were born after. And you still see a significant difference. So what this means is that as moms, or moms to be entering this elimination era, they are less likely to get the disease, not only because some of them are protected by vaccine, but also because the rates of exposure are so low now by whatever means that the vaccine achieved it, directly or indirectly, who are still vulnerable to measles because of these reported outbreaks and whatnot. They don't have that protection that would have been there if we didn't mess with this natural immunity transfer cycle. So this is something that is very sad, that we are eliminating something very precious. And the same thing is now repeating itself in Africa. So this happened in the 90s, and now we are post-elimination, right? In Africa, vaccination started a bit later, and now the papers are coming out showing that now African babies have measles before 6 months of age. And it happens in younger moms. So the older moms, their infants don't have such early measles. But the younger moms who were vaccinated in the 80s, they have exactly the same story as what we had in the United States. And all these papers are published in medical literature, so everyone has access to them. And somehow all of this is disregarded. And okay, we eliminated measles, and now we are going to do the same with mumps, with rubella. Now we are after chickenpox, after rotavirus, and who knows what's next, what kind of mild childhood disease is going to be next, right? And we will be eradicating maternal immunity with those viruses too, so we will be repeating the same mistakes that we didn't learn from this. That's how it is. So right now, I guess, if anyone had measles in their childhood, you are lucky, just like me. I was low responder, so I guess I'm lucky. And for the rest of us, we just have to be very vigilant and not travel with very young infants abroad where measles is still occurring, like maybe France or Japan. And if you hear about measles outbreak in your community, quarantine your infants, because you cannot rely on those who are vaccinated that there will be herd immunity, that it will not reach you. And this is sort of, you have to be aware of it, because measles is still happening and infants are affected. Okay, so I will summarize this part, and then we will go to choices. So natural infections lead to permanent immunity. And we talk specifically about viral infections, right? But then attenuated or inactivated viruses, they don't. They have transient protection, and that also depends on the genetics, right? And so the reason why it is so, or it correlates with that natural infections, or infections with natural, even if you just inject a natural virus, right? That would generate protective serum titers that stay high and kind of level, at least in mice. But the protective serotiters wane quickly after exposure to attenuated viruses. And there is also considerable genetic variation in the human population and in how it affects the immune response, and it cannot be corrected by boosters. So whoever is low will be low. And the last point is that with mass vaccination, what we are creating is a leaky herd immunity, right? So the infection could just leak through, because really only a small fraction of the population are high responders. And because of that, this leaky herd immunity fails to protect those whom it's supposed to protect according to the officials, the infants. But mass vaccination on the other side undermines maternal immunity, which would have provided robust protection if we used it to the full capacity, right? If we didn't just stop with, at 6 months with just placental protection, transplacental protection, we would extend it by breastfeeding. So this is sort of the reality of where we are. And any questions before we start discussing our choices? Yes?
Yeah, so have we seen a drop in mortality since the vaccine was introduced?
So I think the mortality after the vaccine was introduced is proportional. So it stays at the same ratio. But it's not evident from this because it stops at the 60s, right? But I think right now if you read some statistics, like you can look like in France, they had so many cases of measles and so many kids died or whatever, so you can kind of estimate. Yes?
I just had a couple of questions. Can the titers be measured? Like if your kid had 1 dose of the measles vaccine and then you went to the doctor with a simple blood test, can the titers be measured?
Yeah, you can measure them at any time, before vaccine or after vaccine. Yeah. And they would probably try to relate to some kind of standard, to if it's below 120. I don't know what they use as a standard right now because those are a bit old data, right? So, but you would have to have an idea where you are on the kind of on the distribution, right? Where is your titer? Because if you just get the number, it doesn't tell you is it high or low, whatever, it's just a number. Yeah. Yes?
National travel with infants to areas where measles were. What age range would you say would be safe?
So based on the chart on the mortality, it looks like after 2.5 years, it's sort of the mortality is really low, and then it's like stable and low. So 2.5, I would say, is probably a good range. Yeah.
Are there tests to determine what kind of responder you are that will be available to people? Or would that just
Well, the only way right now is you actually vaccinate and see whether you are, and that's not necessarily what you want to do, right? So, so there is that information in the paper about which gene alleles correspond with high or low, but I don't think it's made yet as a commercial test or that it's standardized or proofread in any way. It's just like very preliminary information. Yeah, and I am kind of suspecting that they might not even want to do that kind of profiling because it adds additional costs on, medical care, and they would rather just vaccinate everyone, right? Why bother determining?
And just so everyone knows, we're videotaping this, so I'll get every single one of you a DVD. That's not the camera. Don't worry about it. You got it covered. I'm just as irritated as all of you, so.
Okay.
So
Yes?
leave your email with the girls at the desk, and we'll send you a DVD so you can hear everything.
Yes.
So my understanding was that because of the moms not being able to pass the proper immunity, that measles used to be something people would get in childhood and it would be fine. They would get through it, most people. But now, we're getting more measles than they shouldn't have, either infants or elderly.
Yeah, adults.
And are there actually more people dying in infancy or elderly, or is it the same, or is it now actually less because there's so much less measles?
Well, in terms of absolute numbers, it is probably less. However, if you look at the trends, if you look at WHO statistics by country, both Canada and United States, they're seeing the trends of measles go up, even with imported outbreaks. So this 600 cases, it was actually 700 total in Canada in that year, which was the largest in 10 years or something like that. And in the United States, it's 200, which is the largest in 10 years. So somehow we are kind of going up, but still it's very rare compared to we had thousands and thousands of cases before, right? So in terms of mortality, again, I think there was data from France that was sort of indicating that ratio, in terms of ratio, the mortality is the same. In terms of numbers, right now it's much lower, but it's a little bit growing up.
Will it work then? There's not people dying?
Nobody is dying of measles?
No, wouldn't someone who is pro-vaccine then just say, well, there's less people dying?
That's what they're saying.
Yeah.
But they don't show you what's inside in the black box, right?
Yeah.
They just say vaccine, nobody is dying from measles except in the outbreak, right? Some isolated outbreak. So I think we really need to understand what's happening in the black box. And yes, of course, there are fewer, there is almost no measles, like 200 cases or even 700 cases is nothing. But because it's happening sporadically and unpredictable, you kind of live in fear all the time, because what if it comes to your area? And it doesn't matter who else didn't die. Like if it's going to be your kid is affected by this, right? It doesn't matter that whoever was saved by vaccine, potentially. Yes?
Do you know if there's been any studies that show the effects of the vaccines on people and health, and where that's taken the health issue, just from what's being injected into our bodies?
Okay, so this is the kind of study that everybody wants to have, and the establishment is not going to do it. And so there are sort of private initiatives, or some scientists who are conscious about that want to do it. Problems with funding. So there was actually one group in the United States that they got approval for the study, but they didn't get the funding. So they're kind of asking, hey, people, contribute. We need $1 million to do this study. Okay, if we can collect that, we will know the answer. But the problem with such a study is that there are certain statistical different types of statistical studies, and the ones that would give a perfect answer is actually unethical to do, because what it would entitle is you have a bunch of kids who would be divided randomly, randomized placebo-controlled trial, right? One group will be vaccinated, the other group will not be vaccinated. And the parents are not even supposed to know who got what. So I wouldn't enroll my child in that study, because I don't want the random decision to be made, right? So it's unethical from both perspectives. And of course, those who want to be vaccinated and they are left without the vaccines, they would also protest. And this placebo-controlled kind of study is the only one that can determine the cause and effect. Any other type of study is an association, correlation. So for example, you could say, okay, let's take all the unvaccinated kids who parents chose not to vaccinate and look at their health versus those who didn't. And let's say we see that health is much better in the unvaccinated group. That, of course, it's a hypothesis. It's a hypothesis-forming study rather than addressing the hypothesis, because there could be a lot of, confounding results. Maybe they're healthy because of nutrition, because if their parents even thought about not vaccinating, they're at higher level, higher socioeconomic status that could even think about it, right? So there will be a lot of confounders, and the establishment will shoot that kind of study down by saying that it doesn't prove cause and effect. So that's why this is very difficult to prove scientifically. And we just have to rely on our gut feeling and our observation of what we see, right, in the communities. And so let's discuss the choices now. I think it's a good time. Okay, so we will finish on a positive note, right? So the choices, and we usually think about the choices is whether we have a choice between vaccine injuries and deaths from diseases, right? So, and it's like a lose-lose situation. Whatever you do, it's like not going to be optimal. But we can think about it differently, and we can think, how do we propose to deal with diseases, right? And one choice is what the majority are doing, and what is being pushed on us is a public health model, which is mass vaccination, of course. And what that does is that eventually it eradicates the virus or bacteria, and with that the disease is gone. of course, if that was the correct virus that was identified, there is a difference. There is some controversy with polio, that polio virus is eradicated, but the disease that looks exactly like polio, which is called acute flaccid paralysis, is soaring in India. And it's caused by who knows what. But it's not caused by polio because they cannot even identify polio in there. So, but for diseases like measles, where there is a clear correspondence between the virus that causes the disease and disease, once the virus is gone, the disease is gone. At least that's how it appears. And the problems with this model is, of course, that we have to gamble both on the sides of vaccine efficacy and on the side of vaccine risk, right? Because everyone is different, and what applies to one child will not apply to another. And the second thing about this scheme of things is that it does not invite any concern about what I refer to your natural immune defenses, right? Because it's trying to make it look like it's totally unnecessary to think about this first thing that when you deal with the virus, because we go to the second one. But again, the vaccine immunity is not the same as natural immunity, naturally acquired immunity. So it's possible to get the vaccine, and then still you have to worry what to do about disease, because you can still get the disease. So parents who really want to take responsibility into their own hands and be responsible for the health of their children can choose personal health model, right? And that would be, instead of worrying about eradicating those viruses, just leave them alone and find a way to coexist with those viruses. And we do that by making sure that our immune system can withstand the interaction with the virus in such a way that we get mild disease, not a disease that leads to complications or blindness, pneumonia, whatever else, all these secondary things that were happening before and still happening in Africa. And even here it's probably would be happening because our nutrition is not as good as it should be in general. So let's talk how to, what simple steps one can do, and then of course there is more fine-tuning afterwards, but how to do at least the basic things to ensure robust natural immune defenses. And that will start with breastfeeding, of course. And then after that, it's high-quality nutrition, and I will talk more detailed about everything. And the third one, very important, avoidance of fever-suppressing medications. So let's look in more details. All of this is actually quite well known in the literature, and there are very good reviews that people can look into. For example, this review by Hansen, Breastfeeding and Immune Function. There is a lot more literature, but I guess this one is quite easy to read and very interesting. So when the baby is born, just like the neural system of the baby is not mature yet to deal with the environment, and we provide care for the baby, right? We carry the baby, feed the baby, change the baby. We don't expect the baby to do that by himself. The immune system is also in that state where it was adjusted to its fetal life, and now it needs to make a transition to deal with the environment. And during this transition, the baby needs a surrogate immune system, and that surrogate immune system is provided by breastfeeding. So I mentioned one thing about breastfeeding is protection against specific viruses for which moms had immunity, hopefully. But there is much more to that. So there are molecules or substances or proteins in breast milk that have either very specific or very general antibacterial functions. So, for example, one of them is something called secreted IgA, SIgA. So everything that a mom is exposed to, even at the time when the baby is already born, like any viruses around, gastrointestinal things, and the mom forms antibodies against those. all of it will go into the milk, all of those antibodies, right? So not only from the past, but from the present as well. Then there is something called oligosaccharides. What they do is that they act as decoy for bacteria to bind to them. So if you have any bad bacteria, if the infant gets any bad bacteria in the, in the digestive tract, the bacteria could actually bind to the mucosal surfaces and then result into invasion, right? Invade the gut and result in inflammation. But those oligosaccharides, they sort of resemble the mucosal surfaces, and they act as a decoy so that bacteria actually binds to them and then gets flushed out. So then they're sort of escorted easily out of the system. The same goes for viruses like rotavirus. There are also very important the gut flora of the baby, because lactobacteria that a breastfed infant has and formula-fed infant doesn't, it is actually promoted by breastfeeding, and there is a specific protein called lactoferrin that promotes the growth of that bacteria and inhibit the growth of some bad bacteria, the ones that are not favorable. And the presence of these lactobacteria actually regulate the junctions in the gut. And if you don't have them, you will have leaky gut. And the leaky gut problem is something that we hear a lot in naturopathic circles, and that's related to the gut flora. There are other substances that kill things like Streptococcus pneumonia, alpha-lactalbumin. So there is really a lot, and probably we are just scratching the surface, but there is a lot known about molecular mechanisms of what's in the breast milk besides just nutrition. And not only that, not only we have understanding of molecular mechanisms, there are also empirical data where they show that breastfeeding is protective against invasive bacteria, against ear infections, against meningitis, things like that, and against diarrhea, so any intestinal problems. There are also data on long-term benefits of breastfeeding in the reduction of chronic diseases. So there is everything to be gained from breastfeeding, and nothing to lose. And if an infant needs one vaccine that is 100% safe and effective, that would be breast milk. Okay, so then the baby gets older. What to do next? What kind of nutrition? I'll talk about 2 vitamins just to make a point, because we know good nutrition is good, but how specifically does it affect the immune system, right? So vitamin A and vitamin D. The innate defenses, part of it are the cell types called macrophages. And one thing that they do is when a virus gets into the body, they pick up the virus and start replicating the virus. They are the first cells to be infected. They're sort of sentinels. And once they sense that viral replication in themselves, they secrete a substance called interferon. Interferon interferes with spread of the virus through the body. And the way it does it, it signals to other cells. So interferon signals to other cells to become resistant to viral entry. However, these cells, in order to sense the interferon, they have to have vitamin A. So the function of interferon is really well established in immunology, but what is less known is that you need vitamin A to make interferon work. And we are not ever deficient in interferon because our immune cells will make it, but we can be deficient in vitamin A. And this is the reason why in countries like Africa, where vitamin A deficiency is widespread in kids, measles is a deadly disease. And WHO recommends that kids with measles over there, they have to be treated with vitamin A, and that really helps with mortality, reducing mortality. However, you don't need to wait until you get measles to start with vitamin A. It's much better if you have it ahead of time, because really the symptoms of the disease start 2 or 3 weeks after you got the virus, right? There is an incubation time, and you need your interferon and vitamin A pretty much right away. So we have to be, have vitamin A at all the time. So vitamin D, there is also some literature on that, specifically with regards to flu. And what vitamin D does in the immune system is that it activates some of the cells of the immune system against the innate defenses. It makes them secrete substances which are known as antimicrobial peptides. And those substances, they interfere with the replication of enveloped viruses. And flu virus is an enveloped virus. And this can explain why we have flu mainly in the winter or fall months, and nothing much in the summer, because in the summer we have enough vitamin D through the skin, right? But in the winter we have to supplement. And the thing is that northern societies who are healthy, like Vikings or Eskimo, they had plenty of vitamin D in their diet in the form of cod liver oil or fermented fish or whatever else. And that we know from the research of Weston Price. People probably familiar with that. So Weston Price diet is actually, you might know, it comes up to be very high with vitamin A and D. And they tell to maintain that diet for a different reason, right? For tooth decay, for general health. But actually, there is enough in the literature on immunology that exact same vitamins play a role directly in the immune system. And so you don't need to go after one disease, then another one. You just do one thing, and it kind of covers pretty much everything. So then another important thing to know is the effects of anti-fever medication, which is also called antipyretic in the medical literature. Very curious study was done in Japan by Sugimura. So what that study revealed is that children were admitted to the hospital due to high fever, right? So that was a study of children with high fever in the hospital. And some of them proceeded to develop pneumonia, and others did not develop pneumonia. So then they wanted to know what was done or how were these children handled, those who developed pneumonia versus not. And one thing that came out was the children were treated, when children were treated with Tylenol, paracetamol, I think, in this country, they were more likely to develop pneumonia than if they were not treated or lower levels. And so this is not a placebo-controlled study or anything. It's more like a correlation, but they're actually researching animals, which is more in line with placebo-controlled, where they infect animals with some bacteria or virus and then either treat with fever-suppressing medication or not. And the animal group that is treated has much higher mortality rate from that bacteria than those who are left untreated. And also, we know from studies like here on measles and chickenpox that you just get the disease worse in terms of complications when you treat children with anti-fever medications. So those are a few things that, they're so obvious, and there is enough in the literature to kind of alert us. And of course, once we get that in place and we want to further fine-tune your health and your resistance, and we cannot separate the immune system from the rest of the body, right? So whatever affects the rest of the body, such as toxicity or oxidative stress, it will affect the immune system too, the function. Also, immune system doesn't act in isolation. It is regulated by neural system. There is actually a study, it's actually not a study, but a new field that is emerging, psychoneuroimmunology, where it is clear they try to elucidate molecular kind of mechanisms of how neural system regulates immune system and vice versa. And so we really, when we go deeper and deeper into our health, we have to address many more layers of health, right? So, and I think this is something that holistic doctors help us to do. And so, Michael, do you want to add something to this?
We just know from the principle of health is what she's been talking about, everything that we believe to be true, but it's come full circle to the fact that there's a principle that exists, and that is that your body was designed to heal. Your body was made to heal. From the time you're born till the time you die, there's a healing power inside your body that keeps you alive and healthy. It helps your immune system function. And I was just sharing a study with the good doctor today, and I'm sure she'll read over it if she hasn't already, but the power that lives inside of you can be blocked and interfered with, so you can focus on attacking the disease, or you can focus on building your immune system. And that's what we love to see people do, is just switch that paradigm that they have in their head about this disease is killing the entire world, or this disease or that disease, and change it to a holistic mindset to where we're actually understanding if we build our immune system to be strong enough, then it won't matter what disease attacks us. If we all in this room had 100% immunity, you could throw any disease into the room and we would all kill it immediately. So the key, I think, is to fight in a way where you're thinking before you're actually acting. And you're not just doing what everyone else is doing, because what I got out of what you said was that really there's still a lot of questions, even for people that are professionally studying this stuff, that there's still a ton of questions that are unanswered, and you can never really do a perfect study to find out if this vaccine actually really works, or if it doesn't work. And I think it all begins with the way we think in this room, and that's what's really exciting for me as a practitioner, to see you guys come out and spend time just to educate yourself from someone who has amazing information, and then from here take it and apply it into your life. So I know that we know from experience, from what we see in our office daily, and the chiropractors will agree with me, that when you affect your neurology, that your immune system will change. And when you affect your immune system, that your neurology will change. So we're so excited to see how this impacts your life. And I know that Tetyana's passion is to see people get an understanding of what is physically going on inside of them. So you should, if you haven't read her book yet, you should get it. It's on Amazon. It's called Vaccine Illusion. And for me, it was a real simple read. A lot of this stuff gets pretty heavy. I mean, it gets pretty intense. And if you don't know all the terms, it really breaks it down to a simple level so that you can really understand what she's talking about. And again, I apologize for the music and for the sound that we had, but I'm gonna somehow, I'll get this online. Clayton's working on it on the back there, and we'll get it online, so if you miss something, that you'll be able to see and hear again, so that if you have people that you want to talk to about this, or you want to research it even more, that you'll have access to that. And if you have any questions now, you can feel free to ask.
In the introduction, it was mentioned that you didn't immunize your children and have them vaccinated. You didn't give them any of the vaccinations?
No vaccines.
Because you talked a lot about measles. I've got a 4-month-old, and I've got all the questions and pressures, and the public health nurse calling me saying, "Who's vaccinated yet?" And saying, "No, what happened?" And still deciding.
The thing is that because they vaccinated one, right? And actually before it was much later. But then they pushed it to 1, I think because the latest outbreak in the 90s involved many infants, and so they decided to push it to as early as you possibly can, right? So, but it's really the most vulnerable age is before 1. And after that, if you take the vaccine, you probably don't need it anymore, right? Because as the baby matures, the baby can deal with, the child can deal with it. So at the time when the protection is most needed, you can't have it, one way or the other. And later on, so that's why they kind of have this herd immunity thing, that if you vaccinate, well, it's a little bit for you, but mainly for those other infants who cannot be vaccinated. But it's not true.
And I've gotten to know Tetyana over the past few months, and she faces the same pressures that you guys face. It's just because she knows and she has education in this, you have pressure from people talking to you as well, right?
Mainly from my colleagues.
She's 1 in a million in her profession.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Okay, you.
Yeah, do you see that changing? Like 1 in a million? Like it just, what is the hush hush? Is there other people and colleagues that are?
Okay, yes. So I discovered one more colleague who didn't vaccinate. He was a former associate of the lab where I worked a little bit later. And we discovered it through at some party, at some lab party. And we were talking behind everyone's back so that no one can hear us.
Tell her what
yeah.
your lab manager says when you ask questions. Like,
I don't have a lab manager, I have a mentor.
Mentor.
Supervisor. Well, she got really emotional and she said that I endanger my child. That's what we always hear, right? Then I started explaining to her. Then she said, okay, you're not endangering your child, but you're endangering all these infants and immunocompromised, those who are treated with chemotherapy, whatever, who don't have their own immune system. So that's like another lecture. So, but what can you do?
And this is her mentor.
Yeah, that's a person who's been in immunology for 50 years, and that's how they feel. And that's because, especially when they're so old, they survived the polio epidemic. And they were children at that time, so there is no way that they would be able to assess the situation themselves. And all they know is that there was polio, then there was vaccine, and there was no polio. And basically, there is nothing else that they want to know. Yes?
Now, you were talking about breastfeeding being an immunity defense. How much? Like, for how long? Like, is it okay, let's say your child's down to 1 breastfeed a day or 2 days? Like, how much breastfeeding do you need?
Okay, so for the first 6 months, it's exclusive breastfeeding, right? That's what's recommended, or even maybe longer a little bit. So that's on demand. And I can, my personal experience that it was on demand all the way. Yeah. They will decide, you know. It's impossible to say no to them, I guess. Well, at some point, maybe you have to. But
is there a minimum protection? Like, you know.
Well, I don't know, but you know, as they mature, let's say after 1 year old, they already start developing their own, right, protection. So you just complement that a little bit. And with me, I was working and still breastfeeding, the kind of after 1. And there was a lot of breastfeeding happening during the night, because, you know, that's how it went. So I guess it was enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, over there.
My child ended up getting the chickenpox last year in a mild case. Is that equivalent to their titers, and would they be the same as some of the extreme case of chickenpox? And for their further immunity, because we kept hearing that you can get it twice.
Yeah, the chickenpox is actually weird that I heard a lot, I mean, here and there, that people can get chickenpox twice. But they say it usually happens if the first time you got chickenpox, which was just a few poxes, and later on you get it again with more like full-blown disease. So my child actually got what I think is a chickenpox, but it was just 1 pox. And I think that maybe it is because it was pretty much on the verge of weaning that she got it, like 3.5 years old. And we know her friend got chickenpox as well, so we kind of think it is probably chickenpox. But maybe because she still had my protection, right? It was probably going away, but it was still there. It probably did not establish immunity because the infection wasn't, didn't happen. So the way breast milk works is that it shields the virus, right? But because it doesn't allow infection, it also does not allow the immunity. So then the child has to be exposed again a little bit later in life to get the disease and the immunity. So if you, I don't know, you had mild after just by itself mild, or 6 years old and got mild?
6, 7 years ago that were they were getting chickenpox as well as.
So, and he was not vaccinated. So his was mild. What I hear in the literature that it's usually the other way around, or maybe that's how they want to present it, that those who are not vaccinated are more severe and those who are vaccinated are milder. But it's all by questionnaire, you know. It's how parents describe it, and of course the knowledge of whether the kid had vaccine or not might affect how you describe the chickenpox, right? So it's not really a blinded kind of assessment. So I guess you have all the variations that can possibly happen. Yes.
If your child's sick, and you said that Tylenol is obviously bad for them, and you just let them write it out, is that it? Or do you use
I use something else.
as a preventative, right? But
What I use is homeopathy.
yeah.
So we tried to, when we just started looking into homeopathy, we could not find the right remedy because we were beginners, right? So it didn't work, so we had to let it go, right, for several days. And, you know, then the fever is gone and it's fine and nothing happened. We don't know what that was anyway. Once we kind of understood the principles of homeopathy and we understood that the remedy has to be matched to the mental symptoms rather than to physical symptoms, and we found the right remedy for my daughter, and it works every time, and it's always exactly the same remedy. And the fever, so the child has fever. She had one recently, actually not recently, last year. I give her the remedy. She falls asleep peacefully. 4 hours later, she wakes up, no fever, no nothing. So when it works and if it's correct and it's right on target according to all the homeopathic principles, it works like magic for the reasons that no one understands, right? But if you don't know how to use it, then it's not as effective.
So a naturopathic doctor would be where you'd go then to find the homeopathic remedy?
So there are specialists in homeopathy. They're actually homeopaths, at least in the United States. But what I found is that the doctors don't know the child so well as you are. You don't know their mental state, so they were not as good helping us. So we really had to find the remedy ourselves eventually. Yes, okay.
I've been researching a little bit about the homeopathic alternatives to vaccinations. Have you done any?
Homeoprophylaxis?
Yes.
I heard about it, and I even wrote a foreword for one of the books. But I think right now the research on how effective it is, it's very limited. So it wouldn't really stand up to the scrutiny of, you know, placebo-controlled randomized trials. And to be sure, we would really need to have that on a large scale to have such data. But of course, you know, studies like that, you need a lot of money, not so much to cover the cost of remedies because those are cheap, but just to cover the logistics and human recruitment and this and that. So that adds a lot of overhead, how you call it. And it would be nice if a study like that would be conducted somewhere in Africa where the disease load is actually there, right? Here, like if someone takes prophylaxis for measles, but there is no measles, so how can you know if it worked or not? That's why right now it's at the stage where you cannot be sure, at least I cannot be sure, but I would really support the research in that direction. It's better to find food sources which are high in vitamin A and D. And the easiest one to think about is cod liver oil. If you don't like that, you will have to, you know, find other sources. Grass-fed butter is a very good source, specifically, right? Vitamin D, sorry? Butter which is taken from cows who are grass-fed, as opposed to feedlot. So because there is, you know, beta-carotene in the grass, cow eats that, converts it to vitamin A, and that's what gets into the milk and into the butter, right? But if cows are fed corn and soy, they don't have that, so their butter doesn't have that much vitamin A. So really the good source to consult on that is Weston Price Foundation, and they will tell you everything about what's the best source for all these kinds of foods.
And a lot of the chiropractors here have all the information.
Yeah. Yes.
So those vitamin D drops the doctors give you for your babies, like do you recommend using that or your breastfeeding?
So actually I saw an article which said that vitamin D, the diet that mom has, so if there is vitamin D in the diet, it affects the breast milk content of vitamin D. So you don't have to give the baby vitamin D. If you yourself have vitamin D in your diet in high enough levels, it will get into the baby. So it's up to you, like how you want to do it. Yes.
Do you take too much vitamin D? Like if I was eating, I take vitamin D and I give the baby vitamin D. Is that bad?
Okay, so the only time, but it's actually better to consult someone who knows about nutrition, you know, a specialist. The only time that I heard about vitamin D toxicity is that someone who was on paleo diet and took extra vitamin D. It's because the absorption of vitamin D and you know, fiber can interfere. And on paleo diet, you almost have no fiber. You just eat meat and all those kind of things. So you kind of, if you have excess, you know, there's nothing to interfere with vitamin D to start with, and then you take excess, that might be too much. But on a regular diet, you know, I haven't heard that it would hurt. But Mike, maybe you know more about that?
Test to find out what your vitamin D levels are.
Yeah, so maybe that's the scientific way to go, is to just do a blood test and see where you are and adjust your oral intake accordingly to match the levels that you want.
I take vitamin D, I should give my baby vitamin D.
And you're breastfeeding?
Yeah.
Most likely you don't need. I didn't do that. I just breastfed. Yeah. Yes.
I know that in most conventional diets, our soil is very depleted in essential minerals. How do you feel about tissue salts to enhance the absorption of minerals?
That would probably be a question to a professional homeopath. Yeah, I don't know about that.
I just heard recently that the immunizations before a year of age are virtually useless. Is that true?
Okay, let's talk about one specific one, whooping cough. So you know how children have to be vaccinated at 2 months, 4 months, 6 months? And there were studies who were looking at that kind of regimen, and then they look at the effectiveness of the vaccine. But they look after 6 months and beyond, right? And they determine, placebo-controlled, everything is good, that the effectiveness of that kind of regime is 85%. But it's not after the first dose or after the second or third, but all three. And maybe you only need the last third at 6 months, right? Who knows? Because in adults, they only do one vaccine. I mean, the study had done to do one vaccine, and it was 92% effective, just with one vaccine. So it may be just not how many vaccines you get, but the timing. Now, there was actually a thing that was reported in Israel. There was a baby who died of whooping cough at the 4 months of age. That's the age when they die from it. The baby was actually vaccinated at 2 months. That whole story is should be very strange to the establishment, but not for us. Everyone in his community was vaccinated for whooping cough. His mom, his siblings, everyone in daycare. Mom had for a long time some kind of prolonged cough, which was not conforming to the whooping cough diagnosis. It was just some kind of generic cough. And then all the siblings started coughing. And then the baby got whooping cough and died. Then they took samples from everyone in the family. They all carry the bacteria, the Bordetella pertussis. So it's again, they were all vaccinated. Vaccine made their disease mild, such that it is not even recognizable as whooping cough, but it did not prevent infection. And so things got transmitted to the infant anyway. And they screened the whole daycare, and they also found some kids who didn't show any symptoms, but they were carrying bacteria. And you would say, well, it's good for them that they got milder disease, but the whole point of doing this vaccination is to protect infants, and it doesn't work.